Africa just did the unthinkable. For decades, the world's largest food corporations told us that without American wheat, Africa would starve. But today, that lie has finally crumbled. From Dakar to Dar es Salaam, a silent food revolution is sweeping through the continent, one that has left Washington stunned and the global grain markets trembling. This isn't just a trade story. It's a declaration of food independence, because for the first time in modern history, Africa is saying no more. No more overpriced American wheat, no more dependency disguised as aid, no more feeding foreign profits while African soil goes uncultivated. This is the rise of a new agricultural era, one that's African-grown, African-owned, and African-proud. It all started quietly. African economists, farmers, and policy leaders began asking hard questions. Why were billions being spent every year importing wheat from the United States when Africa has over 60% of the world's uncultivated arable land? Why were foreign seed companies dictating what African farmers could grow? And most importantly, why was Africa still being told it couldn't feed itself? Behind closed doors, a new idea was forming, a food blockade not against the people of America, but against the system that kept African nations trapped in a cycle of agricultural dependence. By mid-year, a coalition of African governments, agricultural cooperatives, and independent grain producers quietly agreed to begin cutting down U.S. wheat imports and shift toward locally produced, hybrid, and indigenous grains. What started as a handful of countries soon spread like wildfire across the continent. Within months, major African grain unions began declaring self-sufficiency seasons, national pledges to grow, mill, and distribute food from within African borders. And that's when Washington noticed. For decades, the United States relied on Africa's wheat market as a quiet but steady economic engine. Every ton of imported American wheat wasn't just grain, it was influence, it was control. It was a chain disguised as charity. So when African nations began turning those ships away, panic rippled through U.S. agribusiness circles. The headlines on American financial networks were subtle but revealing. Global wheat demand shifts, emerging markets turn inward, uncertain future for U.S. exporters. But on African news networks, the tone was different, reclaiming the soil. Grain freedom, the birth of a new food Africa. Across the continent, something historic is happening. In Nigeria, Ethiopia, and Kenya, farmers are turning to ancient grains like sorghum, millet, and teff, crops that thrive in African climates and require less water and fertilizer. In Ghana and Burkina Faso, local cooperatives are producing high-yield African wheat varieties, refined with modern techniques but rooted in traditional wisdom. It's not just farming, it's resistance agriculture. Young innovators are building smart irrigation systems powered by solar energy. African universities are creating new seed banks focused entirely on indigenous crops. And communities are forming grain independence zones, local networks that process, store, and distribute food without relying on imported supply chains. This is Africa rewriting its agricultural destiny. For the United States, this shift isn't just economic, it's strategic, because whoever controls the world's food supply controls the world's future. And for decades, that control has sat firmly in the hands of Western corporations, from seed patents to fertilizer distribution to trade logistics. But Africa is breaking those chains. By investing in local mills, building regional trade routes, and developing fertilizer industries, the continent is creating a closed food loop, one where African farmers feed African families and African profits stay in African hands. It's not about isolation, it's about empowerment. It's not about rejecting trade, it's about redefining it. Because when a continent of 1.4 billion people decides to grow its own food, the world takes notice. Wheat is more than a crop. It's a symbol of dependence. Every imported bag represents decades of policies that undermined local farmers. But now, Africa is turning that symbol into a story of resistance. Imagine walking through markets in Bamako or Lusaka, once filled with imported flour, now overflowing with locally milled African grain. Imagine children eating bread made from African wheat for the first time, bread that tastes of sovereignty. That's not just food, that's freedom. Western analysts are calling it a dangerous experiment, but in Africa, it's called destiny. Because this is bigger than wheat, it's the beginning of a continental awakening, one that links food to freedom, soil to sovereignty, and agriculture to autonomy. From the Sahel to the Great Lakes, from the Horn to the Cape, a new narrative is taking root. Africa will no longer be the testing ground for foreign agricultural agendas. Africa will no longer beg for what it can grow. And Africa will no longer trade its soil for survival. This is the great food blockade, not of scarcity, but of self-determination. So as American grain ships circle empty ports, wondering what went wrong, Africa is busy planting something far more valuable than wheat. independence, because this time the revolution won't be televised. It'll be harvested. The storm has settled. The ships that once carried millions of tons of U.S. wheat to African ports now drift aimlessly across foreign seas. The contracts are expired, the dependency is broken, and for the first time in living memory, Africa is feeding itself not in theory, not in speeches, but in reality. What began as a quiet act of defiance has evolved into the most transformative movement since independence, a food sovereignty revolution that's reshaping the entire global order. From the ashes of dependency, a powerful institution has emerged, the African Grain Alliance AGA, a trade and innovation bloc dedicated to uniting Africa's food economies under one banner. Unlike old Western-controlled agricultural organizations, the AGA isn't dictated by foreign shareholders or external donors. It's African-owned, African-financed, and African-led. Its mission is simple: to make Africa the breadbasket of its people and of the world. Under the AGA, countries now coordinate regional crop calendars, share weather data, and jointly invest in fertilizer plants and milling infrastructure. The alliance is even working on a unified African grain standard, allowing farmers from Mali to Mozambique to trade seamlessly without relying on Western inspection systems. This is more than trade policy, it's continental cooperation reborn. As domestic self-sufficiency strengthens, Africa's next goal is clear export leadership. Nations that once relied on imports are now shipping surplus grain to neighboring regions and beyond. West African ports are bustling again, not with foreign cargo, but with African produce heading to global markets. Nigeria and Ethiopia have begun negotiating deals to supply African wheat and flour to the Middle East. Tanzania is exporting hybrid sorghum to South Asia. Even smaller nations like Rwanda and Benin are selling organic grain products to Europe's eco-conscious consumers. For the first time, the world is not buying Africa's raw resources. It is buying Africa's finished agricultural power. And that's the biggest shift of all. This new agricultural independence has also rewritten Africa's political script. No longer can foreign governments threaten to cut food aid or seed donations as leverage for policy compliance. The old language of control, sanctions, loans, and conditional aid has lost its sting. African leaders now walk into global summits with a different kind of confidence. They're not asking for handouts, they're offering partnerships. And behind that confidence is the quiet hum of tractors, mills, and grain silos, symbols of a continent that finally realized self-reliance is the ultimate diplomacy. The ripple effects go far beyond food. With new agricultural income, African economies are investing in technology, healthcare, and education. Rural regions once forgotten are now centers of innovation. In Burkina Faso, digital cooperatives track grain prices and connect farmers directly with buyers. In Ghana, women-led agri-tech startups are using drones to monitor crop health and prevent losses. And in Kenya, a new generation of university students is studying agripreneurship, a fusion of business and farming that's creating thousands of jobs. This isn't just a food story, it's the story of a continental renaissance. In Washington, the silence has turned to disbelief. Economic strategists now openly admit that Africa's shift could permanently reduce America's global agricultural influence. For decades, the U.S. fed the world and dictated its agricultural agenda. But Africa's rise changes that equation, and as the continent grows stronger, the narrative once built around saving Africa is collapsing. Because Africa no longer needs saving, it needs respect. Even Europe is beginning to pivot, forming new partnerships based on fair trade, not exploitation. The old power dynamic has shifted. The student has become the strategist, but perhaps the most profound change isn't in economics or politics, it is in the soul of Africa itself. For centuries, Africans were told their land was barren, their seeds inferior, their climate too harsh. Yet today, those same lands are bursting with life, feeding millions and exporting abundance. Farmers now see themselves not as laborers, but as nation builders. Children are growing up believing that the food on their plate was grown by their people, not imported from someone else's economy. And that belief, that quiet confidence, is worth more than any foreign aid program could ever offer. The African Grain Alliance has already drafted its next vision: feeding Africa, feeding the world. It's an ambitious goal, but one rooted in real progress. By 2035, Africa aims to be a net exporter of food, not just to its neighbors, but to the global market. That would mean the end of centuries of imbalance, where Africa exported raw gold and imported processed grain. It would mean the dawn of a world where African ports send out ships filled not with unrefined resources, but with the products of African innovation and hard work. A world where Africa controls its soil, its seeds, and its story. The day Africa turned away from U.S. wheat wasn't the day of a blockade, it was the day of a breakthrough. A breakthrough of pride, of purpose, of possibility. The kind that shakes empires but uplifts civilizations. Because in the end, this isn't just about food, it's about freedom, and Africa has finally tasted it. As the sun sets over the golden fields of the continent, one thing is certain: Africa has found its rhythm, its roots, and its roar. This is Talk of Africa 360. Reminding the world, the future doesn't belong to those who feed others for profit, it belongs to those who feed themselves with dignity. Africa's food revolution has begun. And there's no turning back.